Good morning, afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the GEO for Cities report launch towards just and green cities. We've got a fantastic panel and a fantastic range of speakers ahead of us this morning. First of all, just to introduce myself, I'm Johnny Hughes. I'm the WCMC Chief Executive Officer at the United Nations Environment Programme World Conservation Monitoring Centre based in Cambridge in the UK. We work across all different types of ecosystems and are increasingly interested in the urban environment also. I'll be the moderator today. We're really the running order today is really split into two parts. First of all, we're going to hear a few opening remarks from the leadership of UNEP-WCMC, UNEP and the UN Habitat, and then we're going to go on to have a panel discussion with some of the chapter authors and some of the advisory committee which were involved in the pulling together of the GEO for Cities report. Let's, without further ado, introduce some of the speakers this morning. First of all, we're going to hear from Ms. Joyce Mizuya, who is UNEP Deputy Executive Director, followed by a video message. Unfortunately, Maimouna Sharif cannot join us in person, so we have a video message from Maimouna Sharif, who is the UN Habitat Executive Director. This will be followed by a presentation from Maria Helena Langa, who's Mayor of Mandlazaki city in Mozambique. And then we're going to hear from the co-chairs, Ms. Julie Greenwald, who is one of the GEO for Cities co-chairs and a climate change specialist at Go Green for Climate in the USA, and Mr. Diego Martino, who is GEO for Cities co-chair and director of the Asesoramiento Ambiental Estratego in Uruguay. And then we'll move on to our panelists, and I'll introduce those a little bit later on. So without further ado, over to you, Joyce, for some opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Johnny. Honorable ministers, mayors, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as well as distinguished experts. It is a great pleasure for me to jointly launch the Global Environment Outlook for Cities today, together with my colleague in absentia, the Executive Director of UN Habitat, Maimouna Sharif. It is also great to see all of you connected. Your presence is a cause for great hope. It is another sign that cities are poised to be the engines of transformation to address the existential threats of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. It's also a sign that on the ground decision makers understand that urgent action is needed. I am very proud that UNEP and UN Habitat together can provide you with a roadmap for that action in this GEO for Cities report. And let me also thank the teams from UNEP and UN Habitat that have worked, as well as the experts, quite hard on this report. Your presence here is also good news because the scale of the environmental threat we face is unlike anything humankind has ever experienced. The stability that has allowed humankind to prosper for thousands of years is being severely disrupted. There is now more carbon in the atmosphere than at any time in the last 2 to 3 million years. Our hotter planet is supercharging hurricanes and intensifying droughts. It's triggering massive floods that are forcing millions of people from their homes. And this is only the beginning. Climate change has far worse in store. As if this was not enough, humans are also destroying the living world. Massive swathes of forest are disappearing at an alarming rate. Entire ecosystems are collapsing. Air pollution and plastic choke air and waterways. The extinction of plants and animal species is happening 1,000 times faster than the natural rate. The reason this matters is that a stable climate and a healthy living world lie at the very foundation of human well-being. Without the rich diversity and abundance of life, the human species simply cannot flourish or prosper. And this is as true for cities and the people that live in them as it is for anything else. Our success depends on healthy people, inclusive and resilient societies, productive natural systems, and a stable climate. Every single one of these is under threat. If COVID-19 has taught us anything, it is that business as usual will no longer work. You've all heard the speeches by national governments at the two recent conferences of the parties on climate change and biodiversity. We all know that more action and less talk is needed. So how do we make cities more environmentally sustainable, inclusive, and resilient? First, we need to recognize that there are ways that we think and act that are locking us into particular environmental and equity pathways. In the GEO for cities, these are called lock-ins, and they prevent us from being innovative and imagining cities differently. One of the most difficult lock-ins is the way our political economies function at the city level, leading to a tendency to want to maintain the status quo. Certain vested interests are much happier to continue with the way things are than risk transforming a city in a way where they might lose some money or power. The second lock-in that prevents us from innovating in cities is business as usual urban planning. To change cities and make them more environmentally sustainable and equitable, the old ways of planning cities need to change. New innovative practices need to be adopted, like integrating nature-based solutions into cities and adopting green or blue infrastructure practices. My friends at UN Habitat are fostering these transformations in their new urban agenda. Finally, the lock-in of multi-level governance also prevents cities from innovating, because cities don't always control all of the systems that are needed to achieve the transformations we're talking about. They need to rely on provincial, state, and national governments to help them make these changes. For example, if a city wants to achieve net zero carbon by 2050, it needs the other levels of government to dramatically increase the amount of renewable energy on the power grid and the charging infrastructure for electric vehicles. Never have we needed to change so much in such a short time. If we want to prevent economic, nature, and social decline, then we must build cities that achieve net zero carbon and function in that support circular economies. These cities are regenerative and collaborative, where growth is only valued if it contributes to inclusiveness, resilience, and environmental sustainability. These new cities are not dependent on fossil fuels or on over-extracting resources or exploiting people to create value. They are places where human well-being is at the very heart of everything the city does. These cities serve everyone equitably, not the other way around. And tragic as it may seem, the unprecedented stimulus and recovery packages that are being invested to kickstart our economies as we emerge from COVID-19 pandemic 2 can no longer invest in the toxic and gray infrastructure that brought us where we are today, on the brink of ecological collapse. This is where cities like yours play such a vital role. Mayors and city-level decision makers have the power to steer their cities towards a new model of prosperity. There is tremendous opportunities for cities that take up this challenge, who dare to explore, to experiment, to innovate, and to collaborate. But, and I want to be very clear here, for cities who fail to transform, only disaster lies ahead. There is a Swahili proverb saying, aliye kando haangukiwi na mti. A tree does not fall upon someone who stands aside. The climate crisis and the unraveling of the living world is the falling tree, and cities that fail to get out of the way will be crushed. As these systemic risks disrupt our lives, cities that fail to adapt will find it impossible to attract finance, talent, and citizens. With so much at stake, clinging to business as usual is not just risky, but irresponsible to the people that cities serve. So what can cities do? The GEO for Cities report we are launching today provide a vision and pathways to achieve this vision. The Executive Director of UN Habitat in her recorded message will speak to this in her remarks. These pathways serve as a guide for cities that are smart enough to embark on individual and collective journeys of transformation. Some cities have already set off on this journey, sparkling important change in their communities. These cities are leading similar transformations in food systems, mobility, fashion, and resource use as they switch to circular approaches that eliminate waste and protect the natural world. But living in unprecedented times means moving with unprecedented speed. Cities can seize this momentum and mobilize public investments to stimulate this transformation. City leaders who work to bring about this green and just world and whose communities thrive as a result will be hailed as the pioneers of the new economy. I hope all of us here today can work together to drive the change we so desperately need. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Joyce. Okay, can we please now play the video from Maimouna? Thank you.
Cities today, together with the Deputy Executive Director of UNEP, Ms. Joyce Masuya. For many decades, UNEP and UN Habitat have worked tirelessly to improve urban environmental conditions globally and tackle the multiple challenges of our world cities in the areas of climate change and biodiversity. We have done so by providing sustainable solutions, including resource-efficient, resilient tools and services. The GEO for Cities report is the latest effort in our collaboration. Today, I would like to share with you two key messages from the report. One, it is vital to recognize the role that cities play in achieving greater sustainability of our planet. In the last decades, many urban leaders have taken impressive steps towards addressing the multiple challenges of equity, environmental sustainability, and poverty. Cities around the world remain at the forefront of our most complex and interconnected challenges. In the report, we have tried to understand some of the persistent barriers that we are seeing in our transitions towards more sustainable and equitable futures. Our analysis shows that we must expand our stakeholder base to include more voices in meaningful and effective decision-making. We also need strong leadership from governments, civil society, and the private sector at the city scale. We need the right enabling policies and development commitments at national and international scale. And we need the right financing and governance instruments to close the gaps between them. The second point I would like to make is that cities have enormous potential to reimagine urban futures. The GEO for Cities report offers hands-on approaches how to do this. City leaders and urban residents need to be able to visualize how our urban future could look. The models we build must address how cities function and evolve, who participates and benefits, and how we move around and how we produce and consume goods and infrastructure. Only then can we better protect and restore our natural environment. The GEO for Cities report helped us to rethink current political and economic structures, institutions, policies, and behaviors, and offers concrete interventions that cities can adopt to move towards more sustainable, resilient, and socially just futures. Notably, it targets both the global north and global south. The report offers 3 dimensions of integrated action for urban transformation. Dimension 1 focuses on net zero circular cities. Cities must make significant changes to their energy and material flows to achieve massive reductions in resource extraction, greenhouse gas emissions, and other pollution and waste. Dimension 2 zooms in on resilient and sustainable cities. It looks at how changes in urban form can protect vulnerable urban places and populations from environmental degradations, climate change impacts, and natural disasters. Dimension 3 highlights inclusive and just cities. It encourages sustainable individuals and institutional behaviors and governance frameworks that promote justice for human and non-human species. There is no single blueprint for urban change all around the world. In this inaugural joint report, UN Habitat and UNEP provide a variety of actionable solutions for a diversity of cities. GEO for Cities also resonates with the new urban agenda, which was approved by all UN member states in 2016 and lays out how cities can be sustainably planned and managed. UN Habitat has led the effort to incorporate the new urban agenda's principle for a low carbon, resource efficient, and socially just urban future for all. Getting our cities right means implementing urban development plans that fully integrate environmental protection mechanisms. I would like to close with sincere congratulations to our colleagues at UNEP and UN Habitat and the whole scientific expert team in producing this relevant and impactful publication. My hope is that those of you who have listened to us today will be able to take actions to make our cities fairer, greener, and healthier, and convert into reality the transformative visions that the GEO for Cities has provided. Thank you.
Great, many thanks. Might I now invite Maria Helena to provide her opening remarks? Maria Helena, are you hearing me? Okay. If Maria Helena is not on video, I propose then we move instead to the short presentation that we're now going to hear from the GEO for Cities co-chairs. I understand that Julie, you're going to go first, and you've prepared a few slides for us, which is great. So I'm going to hand over to Julie at this point, and we may come back to Maria Helena if we can find her again. So over to you in the meantime, though, Julie.
Great. Thanks, Johnny. And I mean, it wouldn't be a virtual launch without a little bit of a glitch in terms of presentations, but we will carry forward. And Diego and I, much like we've done throughout this process, will actually trade off with each other. So for those of you who have been working with us over the past 2.5 years, this will be a kind of familiar model, hopefully where you will see how Diego and I start off intending to split things and then it comes together jointly. So that's good. I first just want to start off by really thanking everyone. Thank you to UNEP and UN Habitat, of course, as the co-leading institutions on this publication. UNEP-WCMC, thank you for organizing this launch event. But most importantly, we want to express our appreciation for the author teams. You all have stuck with this through a difficult and long process. It was probably never going to be what you thought you signed up for, but certainly having COVID-19 and a pandemic hit in the midst of it and trying to carry on with this report and transitioning from having in-person meetings to only online meetings and adapting to this, showing a lot of resilience and adaptation to continuing to be authors and contributing to this as all of our lives faced a pretty major upheaval. Really cannot thank you all enough for how fantastic you were, for how productive and engaging the conversations always were. And also with thanks to our advisory committee, who also from the beginning shepherded us through this process and helped us to stay focused and also think about how to connect with other ongoing publications and events and programs. So, and finally, there was a very strong set of reviewers, maybe too active sometimes, as we did 2 rounds of reviews. And I think the authors, while very appreciative of the efforts that the reviewers put in, there was a lot of enthusiasm, let's say, with the comments. So just a thanks to everyone for all their contributions. And of course, to my co-chair, Diego. I would not have survived this without him. And we made, I think, a great team, and it's been a journey. So thanks to everyone. So next slide, please. So the first split in the presentation was that Diego and I was supposed to work on context and Diego was supposed to work on process. And then as we came to realize, context and process, when we were talking about GEO for cities, are pretty well integrated. So we also realized it wasn't quite linear, and it was very difficult to kind of draw out summarize what the main context that we were considering. And I think that's one of the things, if you take away one thing, I think from this presentation, there's a couple of things that I think are really special about this report. And one of them is that I think it not only talks about climate change, but also talks about other environmental issues. And while I think that's increasing in the city space, and there's more conversation with urban stakeholders about looking more comprehensively at environmental dimensions, that hasn't always been the case. There's been a stronger focus on climate change. So I think one of the great things is that this also brings in issues around biodiversity and water, and we'll talk about that more when we get to chapter 3, but it also adds to the complexity, both in terms of what are the sort of immense enormity of the problems we face, and Joyce touched on this in her opening words, but also about what are the solutions, and what are solutions that not only work for the natural systems as well as our cities, but also really focusing on people. And that's something I think else that with this report, that we really tried to make sure that we were thinking about people and the impact that these changes that we're proposing and the issues that we're talking about, what is the impact that this has on people who are urban residents, people who are residents outside of cities. There was a lot of discussion about teleconnectivity, defining this, a lot of discussions around transformation. And of course, when we first started this process, we were really thinking about the big conference of the parties, both the UNF-CCC, but also the CBD. And of course, originally, these got delayed due to COVID-19, as so many things did. But, these were always moving around the World Urban Forum. And, so I think these word bubbles, although they don't capture everything that was discussed, the intention is really to show that there was this very rich conversation that was ongoing as we prepared this report, as we tried to take into account, building on what's come before, but also the changing circumstances of the world we live in, and sort of rapidly seeing how the circumstances that we were working in, but that also the issues that we're trying to address were. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Diego to talk about the process on top of this context.
Thank you, Julie. I would also like to thank all the same actors that Julie thanked, and also I also survived thanks to having Julie throughout the whole process. Laura, if you can do just one click, there's the two words that come out. One more. Two words that come out from the process. Part of this was already said by Julie, but heterogeneity of cities. That was something that kept us awake, not only at night, but also during the discussions that we had with the authors. How do you communicate with only one report to this incredible variety of cities that we have? Small cities, growing cities, decreasing in size cities, cities in the north, in the south, with different geographies, context, but only one report to communicate to them all. And in particular, how do you communicate on policy and on policy and on change? This was one of the biggest challenges that we faced while we were preparing the report. And that's why when we come to chapter 4, you will realize that in no way the visions are presenting blueprints, but they are presenting disruptive ideas in order to move into the future, because there's such a variety that it's really hard to communicate with one simple report. So with that, I think that we might be a bit behind. So let's move to the next slide, which is chapter 2, and we will be moving through chapter 2, 3, and 4, and presenting a very schematic description of the chapters. Yes, Julie, over to you.
Thanks, Diego. And just to say, there is a chapter 1, and our chapter 1 is really a call to action. And Miss Maria Helena, well, it was co-authored by 2 mayors, or one former mayor and one current mayor, Maria Helena, who hopefully will be able to join us and provide her thoughts, and David Miller, who's the former mayor of Toronto. And that really represented actually this heterogeneity of cities, right? We had one representative of a large global north city and a mayor of a small global south city. And I think in what is a discussion between them, that is chapter 1, it shows not only the urgency and the call to action, as well as the potential for cities to be leaders, but also that there are synergies and similarities between cities of different sizes and circumstances. And there are some ways in which they're really facing fundamentally different problems, and how the development of those solutions, of course, really need to address that local context. So chapter 2, and this was mentioned before by Joyce, and we'll have Ria, our coordinating lead author for this chapter in the discussion. But just to quickly say, I think what's really special about this chapter is it not only talks about the state of cities and how this growth has been rapid, but also and really zeroes in on issues of escalating inequality. And so again, this people focus and what the way the cities have grown has looked like for many people on the ground, but it goes into much detail about these city lock-ins. And I think what is really useful in this chapter and special is I think how frank we are. There's a lot of mincing of words about the fact that while cities may aim to be leaders, as is presented in chapter 1, there are a lot of issues that really can act as blockages. And there are a lot of ways in which cities are confined by circumstances within the city and beyond, and that this has really resulted in this uneven growth that is also really damaging the planet. There is hope, and chapter 2 does end with some hopeful ways of catalyzing environmentally and sustainable just transformation. So, and trying to look at what are some of the areas in which we've already seen that cities have been able to break out of this. So tapping into inclusive and participatory decision-making, bringing about partnerships that go across different urban stakeholders, and also ways to institutionalize positive change. So chapter 2, although it, I think, highlights many of the difficulties that cities face, also does end on a positive note about inklings that we see for ways to change. But before we get into the more positive things, I'll turn it back over to Diego to outline what chapter 3 has to say about the state of the environment for cities.
Thank you, Julie. Laura, if we can move to the next one. So chapter 3 is the state of the environment and in cities. And the intention in chapter 3, well, it starts by showing how cities relate to their surrounding environment. Impacts happening within cities are felt in the environment within the city, in the peri-urban area, but also far away. That's what is trying to be communicated with that figure over there. But also cities are influenced by environmental changes outside their boundaries, as the examples that were spoken before. And here, what the chapter did was it took the drivers coming from the GEO-6. The GEO-6 report has 5 drivers that are described in the report. This GEO for cities is a derivative product of GEO-6. So it analyzed how these drivers of environmental change are actually affecting cities. One example of changes in the environment that are affecting cities, changes from outside cities that are affecting cities can be, for example, dust storms or wildfires that happen outside cities but are affecting air quality within city boundaries. Another example can be meteorological events producing droughts and floods, which can affect water quality and water quantity and the provision of water to urban areas. So after that analysis, the chapter moves on to see, okay, what are the impacts that cities have on the environment also locally and globally? What are the environmental changes happening within cities that are affecting the urban boundaries and citizens living within those urban boundaries and beyond? And a classic example can be greenhouse gas emissions that are responsible for climate change. Most of those happen within cities but are affecting the environment globally. And also many of the impacts that are happening within cities on, for example, air quality. 98% of the cities with more than 100,000 people in low and middle income countries are exceeding WHO guidelines for PM 2.5 and PM 10. So the impacts within and outside cities were analyzed. And this was done following the components from GEO, the typical components, which are air, biodiversity, freshwater, oceans, coast, and land. And finally, the chapter ends by showing how different population groups living in cities are and will be, and there's, at least in my slide, there's a missing part there, but are and will be affected differently by environmental changes. Vulnerable populations have less capacity to isolate themselves from environmental degradation. For example, living conditions can affect exposure to infections, diseases, but also to meteorological events. So there's a big issue highlighted there in chapter 3 about equity and environmental change within cities. If we move to the next slide, Laura, we go into chapter 4. Thank you, Laura, which is cities that work for people and planet. So here we have what Julie was mentioning as hope. And I've seen in the last 20 to 25 years how cities have moved from the villains in the environmental arena to places of hope, places where an opportunity to reimagine urban futures, and with that, avoid the looming environmental crisis. So this has been a tremendous change in the perception of cities, and this is something that is being highlighted in chapter 4, where a vision is provided. As was said before, and I will go quickly through this vision has 3 dimensions that are selected because they lie at the heart of how cities work, and they can be reshaped to address environmental challenges, and they are net zero circular cities, resilient and sustainable cities, and inclusive and just cities. And as I highlighted a few seconds ago or minutes ago, these are not blueprints. These visions should not be considered blueprints because there's such a variety of cities that it's impossible to present a blueprint to be followed. And this was a big challenge, how to produce in one report dimensions that actually speak to such a variety of cities. So these dimensions, what they intend is to disrupt embedded ideas about cities and urban life, and therefore help us rethink current political and economic structures, institutions, policies, and behaviors with the objective of moving forward towards more sustainable cities. And finally, it needs to be considered, and here, Laura, I ask you for one click, that these dimensions are interdependent. For example, a change on revegetation happening in the context of nature-based solutions can have a negative effect on health due to allergies, for example, which affects the other dimension. And with one more click, we see a positive interaction, which would be that food production, participatory governance, and urban planning, which happen in dimensions 1 and 3, can have a positive effect on dimension 3, making cities more resilient and more sustainable. So with this, I end up with chapter 4, Julie, and I pass it over to you for the final chapter. By the way, I know that Giancarlo is here. He's one of the panelists. I don't think I've seen Jennifer, who's the other CLA among the attendees, but she might be there. And Andres Gul is here, and he's one of the co-chairs of chapter 3, together with Barbara. Thank you. Bye, Julie. Over to you.
Thanks, Diego. Okay, so Maria Helena has joined, so we've been told to make sure we move quickly here. So I'm just going to provide, I guess, a very brief overview and of what chapter 5 says, in hopes that this will take you to the report to read in more detail about these things. But as Diego said, one of the things we really struggled with is, obviously, we didn't want to provide blueprints because solutions need to be specific to cities. At the same time, we did also want to make sure that we showed that there are ideas about, and also recognizing that no city, even the best city, has gotten everything perfectly achieved in an urban transformation that addresses all of these issues. But we did want to make sure that we left with both ideas about, how an urban transformation could be catalyzed, as well as some examples of cities that have done it well, and linking to these visions the pathways. So on the left-hand side, we just have a overview of what's in the chapter, and that we have a focus on both net zero and circular cities pathways, as well as a decarbonization pathway, which features examples from Toronto and Beijing. The resilient and sustainable cities pathway, which includes an excellent case study from Cape Town about how they used the zero water stress and shock to help institutionalize change. And then the inclusive and just city pathways, which includes case studies from 2 very different cities. One is Seattle in the US, and how it really worked on equity and environment issues, bringing them together to address historical inequalities. And one from Rosario in Argentina that also looks at issues around justice and incorporating that with nature and resilience. So and then the chapter ends with some ideas about what are some of the key lessons that we can take away, looking across all of these pathways and looking across all of these cities, what we've been able to learn about what can help to drive this kind of urban transformation. Last slide. And then we have some very brief. Sorry?
Good morning.
Good morning. Just one last slide and I will turn it over. The very last section is actually concluding remarks from Diego and I. And we just wanted to end where we end the publication, which is that I think the last two and a half years has further reiterated just how urgent and dire this need to reconfigure our cities are, how critical this is for coming up with solutions that work for people and the planet, and that although the challenge is enormous, I think we can take hope and we can take away some really positive examples, and there is the potential for this change. It's challenging. It's not without addressing some strong structural and historical barriers to action, but that it is possible if we can reimagine and turn these visions into reality. So once again, just to thank everyone who's been involved with this, and turning it back over to Johnny, and looking forward to the panel discussion with all of our authors. Thanks.
Great, thanks Julie, thanks Diego, thanks our co-chairs. I am now going to move back. I think we do have Maria Helena with us now. She's nice to join us, so great. So Maria Helena, if you could provide your opening remarks, you have 5 minutes. We're running a little bit behind time, so if you could help us out by sticking to within 5 minutes, that would be great. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. Can you see me? Hello?
We can see your lunch. I think maybe the camera is there we go. Making us all feel hungry. Okay, over to you.
Sorry. Can you see me?
Yes.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's great.
Good afternoon. I am Maria Helena Langa from Mozambique. Honorable ministers and mayors, Excellence, Deputy Executive Director of UNEP, Executive Director of UN Habitats, distinguished experts of the launch event of the GEO for Cities report, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the municipality of Mandacas and on my own behalf, I want to thank you for this opportunity that we have been given to participate in this edition of GEO for Cities. It is extremely important for us because we managed to expose the challenge that our community is facing in relationship to climate change, shocks and stresses, but above all, we had the opportunity to interact, participate, and learn how important and globalized the problem is when looking to a developed world city like Toronto. We joined me in this interesting adventure. We came to realize that the solution does not depend only on a single nation, but on the whole society, each one in this corner adopting measures that can stifle the impact of climate changes. It is time for each and every one of us to take this fight from ourselves to others with small gestures, and that will add up to big global action for a better world. The municipality of Mandacas assumes the responsibility of continuing to invest and advocate in prevention and mitigation actions, inviting the rest of the world's municipality to join with fights that will only bring benefits to our society so that it is strong, safe, green, and resilient. Please kindly join us all, promote a less risk society where we can live without fear for the future. United for a climate and safe cities. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Maria Helena. We are now going to move to our panel discussion. We're a little bit behind schedule, so I'll very quickly introduce the panel before we get going. And I'm going to start off with asking the panel a few questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So our panel, a very distinguished panel with us today. We have Jeb Brugman, who's founding principal of Resilient Cities Catalyst in Canada. We have Giancarlo Delgado Ramos, who is a professor at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. We have Andreas Gull, a professor of the Universidad de los Andes in Colombia. Emmanuel Pino, who is director of city diplomacy at C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group from France, joining us from France. We have Ria Raiman, who is infrastructure resilience senior specialist at UNDP in India. And we have Neha Sami, who is Associate Dean of the School of Environment and Sustainability at the Indian Institute for Human Settlements. So a very distinguished panel. I'm going to ask the first question, if I may kick off, of our panelists, and that's a question to Ria, who was the author, the principal author of chapter 2. So listening to the speeches and presentations this morning, as it is my time, this afternoon is many people's time, it might seem that the science is clear on what needs to be done in terms of urban sustainability and equity. I think the case is there. So the question remains, why has this not been done in more cities? And in the report, you talk about factors that tend to lock in, and Joyce mentioned this, lock in a majority of cities into environmentally unsustainable and unequal urbanization paths. You've defined these, actually, you called these lock-ins. Could you explain why you've chosen that term and explore what the main barriers are that cities face when trying to become more environmentally sustainable and equitable in the context of these lock-ins? Over to you, Ria.
Yeah, thank you, Johnny, for that question. And yeah, I think I'll just, to push the point forward put about by Joyce, lock-ins. So I'm sure the audience out here is not, are aware of the challenges cities face, the persistent challenges of inequality, pollution, environmental degradation, resource depletion, biodiversity loss. So majority of the cities are currently on unsustainable trajectories, and they contribute to multiple dimensions of ecological, social, and economic damages. There have been several international commitments, national, regional, local efforts to facilitate sustainable urban transitions, but all these challenges have, these inherent challenges have remained, and also in the past decades actually intensified. So there are key factors or, structural or systemic barriers or forces for that matter, which lock these cities into these environmentally unsustainable and unjust trajectories. So that's the whole rationale behind using the word lock-in. Basically, these are systemic challenges which commit in a way and involuntarily commit the cities to the current unsustainable trajectories. In this chapter and throughout this publication, we have looked at lock-ins as complex and structural barriers, interlinked, interconnected, interdependent lock-ins, which are deeply rooted in the political economy of cities, in the governance ecosystem of cities, and these lock-ins contribute to the business as usual or the status quo which the cities are on right now, especially with respect to the urban planning approaches and the visions that are there in place. So effectively, the lock-ins here refer to are representative of the systemic barriers, and they are the barriers that hinder positive urban transformations. With respect to how does one overcome these barriers, and especially in this chapter, we've tried to explore, how do these barriers act? What are these specific within these barriers? What are the specific challenges cities face? So these lock-ins or these barriers, we've tried to bucket it into 3 categories, where the first aspect of this issue is underpinned on the structural drivers of the political economy that often lead cities to function in a way that the governance aspects are usually captured by vested interest. Again, Joyce mentioned about the existing political economy, which are more focused on a more resource-intensive model, mostly extractive models, which do not focus on, they are a far cry from the more nature-positive or carbon-neutral models of development. Then the dominance of business as usual urban planning and approaches, again, infrastructure developments, mostly focused in the urban areas. They don't focus on integrating nature. Again, nature-based solutions, there is a lot of scope on integrating or having hybrid models of infrastructure systems where you have the gray and green infrastructure being implemented parallelly. Again, with respect to giving us dual benefits of not only reducing the emissions, but also addressing the adaptation aspects of both climate change impacts and enhancing the resilience of cities. Then lastly, with respect to the governance systems, the governance systems or the ecosystems which cities operate in, there are multiple levels. The regional levels, cities again governed by national policies, and in most cases, cities have no role or no voice on the table with respect to the development models that need to be adopted, especially with respect to the governance being fragmented. Low capacities, data challenges are some of the aspects which further impedes the governance barriers and challenges and locking cities into an unsustainable trajectory. Thank you.
Many thanks, Ria. That was a very insightful answer. This concept of lock-ins, I think, is a very powerful one, and is the kind of thinking that we're seeing coming through in the report, which could help at least challenge some of these unsustainable models that currently we're seeing in cities across the world. I'm going to move on now to chapter 3, and I'm going to invite a question to Andres, who was one of the principal authors of chapter 3. So Andres, the report and the science, I think, shows it very clearly that a sectoral approach, a siloed approach to urban planning and delivery is not working. There's a need for integrated approaches that consider interlinkages between cities and equity and the environment. And it's only really through that taking that more multidisciplinary integrated approach that we're going to solve some of the challenges that cities are facing. So what do equity differences actually mean in the urban environment for you, and what is the impact on urban residents? And more to the point, kind of moving to the solution side of things, what do you think are the main linkages that are often neglected when planning urban policies? What are the key things we really need to fix here?
Thanks, Johnny. Those are tough questions. I'll try to make as a concise and short answer as possible. With regards to your first question, there are many differences in terms of equity for urban dwellers. So you can look at it within the city. For example, there are the differential impacts on health issues, accessibility issues, and usually more vulnerable populations are the ones who suffer the most. For example, in terms of air pollution, people who live in very dense environments or that do not have access to clean fuels usually have more health problems related to air pollution. You also have wealthier people, to put it in a way, usually have more access to green spaces. So within the city, you have lots of equity issues, but you also have equity issues between the urban dwellers and the rural dwellers, to put it in this dichotomy, although there is more variety of environments, not only urban or rural, but you see that, for example, in many instances, the sustainability and well-being of urban dwellers has been at the expense of what happens in other areas. So considering your own well-being at the urban level often neglects what happens to other people and to ecosystems in other places. So basically, what I'm trying to say here, and that's one of the things that probably needs to be considered more fully policy and planning of cities is the fact that there are lots of trade-offs. What happens in the city has trade-offs in many other areas. And as a city planner, if I want to consider the sustainability of a city, I also need to consider the sustainability of the supporting system of that city. And that usually involves looking at different locations where water comes from where food comes from. So there are many different, that's one way of, let's say, one of the ways in which I think city planners need to look more carefully into. And basically the environment and how cities function doesn't stop at the limit of the city. So planning, although I know it's very difficult to consider it because of political reasons, one of the issues that is essential is that planning for the city requires looking beyond the city, and that's not often taken into account in many cities. And the other issue, very shortly, that I believe it's crucial, is the fact that in many instances, mostly for smaller and medium-sized cities in the developing world, which are the cities that are growing the most, basically they are reacting to unplanned growth of the cities rather than planning for the future. In many instances, it's difficult to confront what's going to happen. So what I'm trying to say is that we have to move away from a reactive way of planning to a more proactive way of planning. That's what I would say. And I'll leave it there so other people have a chance to say something.
Yeah, I think that last point, it segues quite nicely actually to the next question in the next chapter, but certainly the issue of, you know, how to plan when rapid urbanization is, you know, happening at such a pace that it's almost impossible to get on the front foot and be proactive in terms of planning. Or maybe revisit that one in the when we open it up to the audience. Okay, so we're moving on now to chapter 4, and Giancarlo was one of the principal authors of chapter 4. Giancarlo, my question to you is that there are different types of cities, as we've just been hearing, and every city is ultimately different, it's unique, but it is possible, I think, to build on some of the similarities to design integrated pathways and practices that can guide action. So I suppose the question is, what are the main characteristics of what future cities could look like? What are those shared characteristics, and what could we look forward to seeing in future cities? And in the context of that, when we consider cities as solutions to some of the societal problems that we're facing at the moment, what are the main dimensions that should be considered? Over to you on that one.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I think, well, it has been already said. We thought about the huge diversity that cities have, the potentials also that cities can profit to move towards a more inclusive, sustainable urban life. And those 3 dimensions are net zero circular cities that are pretty much focused on urban efficiency and circular economy. And we use a urban metabolism approach to realize the potential in terms of efficiency for food, water, energy, buildings, materials, waste, and emissions. But of course, each city will have if it's a small city, well, there's a potential that it will be very different for a growing city and large city at the same time. So every city will have to explore what fits better, which are the priorities to profit first. Dimension 2, it's very close related. All the dimensions work at the same time. So dimension 2 is more about urban form and the built environment. And we integrate in that dimension the resilience and sustainability dimension of cities. So we are looking at the biophysical features that will be better for cities in their different biophysical contexts in order to be more resilient and move towards sustainable pathways. And of course, that it relates very close to what just Andres was saying in terms of the relevance of urban ecosystems, peri-urban ecosystems, and beyond. The importance of nature-based solutions, and those will differ from city to city as well, and the local conditions of each city, the typology of infrastructure that will be need to put in place. A lot of the infrastructure will need to change progressively. It is related as well to access and mobility, and of course, social resilience and networks that will need to be improved in the future. And we use different future scenarios. We were talking about more immediate actions in the very short term, and we are talking as well intermediate and kind of midterm actions all the way to the mid of the century. So each city will have to explore the transitional actions that will need to take as soon as possible, and the transformational actions that will take more in the following years all the way to the midterm temporal scale. And the last dimension, it's related to inclusive and just cities. It's more about the inclusiveness not only of humans within the city, and taking into account the equity aspects that well, we have a lot of inequities in a lot of the cities around the world, but it's also about inclusive, having a consideration about other types of species, not only the humans. So that's why we're talking about multi-species cities. So it is about biodiversity, it's about habitat value, it's about multi-species justice, as I just said. And of course, it's related to governance. Now, all the capacity building that is needed to change the participatory governance and the relevance of participatory action and management of cities, of course. And it's about urban planning and system designs on the basis of that participatory action. And of course, we're thinking about health and well-being while we're thinking on inclusiveness and just cities. So I think that's it, and all these dimensions work together. And of course, we need to take into consideration all the dynamics, social, economic, and cultural and political dynamics that take place in each city in order to actually prioritize and move forward as expected.
Great, thanks, Giancarlo. I'm going to develop this train of thinking a little bit. So Mamuna actually mentioned earlier that cities have enormous potential to reimagine urban futures, and that this is a really positive hope for the future. And Ria also mentioned that there are ways to overcome some of these lock-ins that we need to unlock, frankly. So what are the actions? I'm going to come to Jeb now, who was involved in chapter 5 of the report. What actions are required to reach green and just cities that Jan also just talked about? And can you give us a success story of a city that you're comfortable with, and saying, okay, this is a really good example of how to follow the kind of pathways that we need to follow in order to overcome these lock-ins and create a more positive urban future? Over to you, Jeb. Not an easy question, I realize.
Thank you. No, it's quite clear. You know, I'm of mixed mind, and it was a challenging chapter to write. Our chapter 5 was really, okay, what is our advice to city leaders, to executives, to planners, to the professions that design our cities, about how to make a transformational change in the outcomes of cities across all the areas that Gian has outlined. And you know, we started with the concept of lock-in, and then develop a concept of what the pathway is for this sort of systemic change in outcomes. Transformational pathways is what we articulate them as. in the chapter, and we looked into a number of them dealing with circular economy, the material and nutrient cycles of cities, with justice issues, with resilience, how cities are prepared and deal with the perils that they confront, and a number of others, climate change, for instance. And I think our sober conclusion is that although cities are this very malleable thing that we can redesign fundamentally how they cycle and use resources and how the social economy is elaborated, that getting there involves so many complex elements, that cities are highly complex systems in their own right, and then they're open systems. They're open to all of the shocks and pressures and technologies that are brought from the outside or not brought from the outside to help them. We think of vaccines today as an example of that. That it's very hard for those who have the limited responsibility to manage and govern a city to undertake that transformation in its own right. So the transformation of urban spaces, it really has to be multi-scalar, and this is where the United Nations plays such a fundamental role. City leaders have done many things, and I'll articulate it to come to your question of where the hope lies, where we can shine a light on a positive future. But they can do many things to demonstrate what that transformation looks like in any system, but without having the collaboration of the other scales of government, without, if you're a developing country, without having sufficient overseas development assistance given, technical assistance provided, without the corporate sector being willing to change the way they produce and the way they supply goods and services to people, it doesn't really happen. And so we know, for instance, in cities with the United Nations playing in UNEP and UN Habitat at the heart of this for now decades, we have many, many good best practices that shine a light on the potential of the city, to come to your positive point here about that creativity. But fundamentally, the system's outcomes don't change that much. So we look at cities, for instance, I looked at my own city. I've been involved in greenhouse gas mitigation and climate change work in Toronto since the early 1990s. And Toronto has made some progress with all of the resources it has put, with all the levels of government behind them, in reducing their greenhouse gas footprint as a city. But it's still just really nominal change relative to the scale of reduction of GHG emissions that is required. And so I think John in chapter 4 authors articulated it correctly. There are best practices that show the potential of cities to be ecological in their function, to become more just. And then there are transitionals, as John coined the phrase, transitional actions that they can take that open the window for a pathway of systemic change. And so oftentimes a transitional opportunity comes with a new leadership, a new government, but it's also through crisis. And I think what we've seen in the face of the COVID crisis, when we see cities needing to rebuild from a major catastrophic event, the potential there to break down these silos that have been articulated, to design entirely new systems opens up. So a simple case, in the COVID era, when we had to close down so many businesses, we started reimagining what a street is in a city. So streets became places for markets again. Streets became places for recreation again. Streets became multimodal again. We created, we brought back in the bicycle as a mode of transportation, for instance, because the crisis forced us to use our assets and our resources more efficiently. And so crisis is often a trigger of these sorts of changes. But ultimately, the transformation that's required, and what we articulate using a variety of cases in chapter 5, is it requires change in the legal policy context. It requires introductions of new technologies. It requires cooperation with industry in the way that products are designed and the way that waste products are recycled into the economy. It requires the re-education and support for consumers and residents of cities to adopt new behaviors. It requires fundamental redesign of our institutions and cities. And so we look at a number of cases, and I can't shine a lot to get to your last part of your question. One cannot shine a light on any city that is going through the scale of the transformation that is needed to achieve the SDG implementation, to achieve the outcomes that are targeted in Paris and the Glasgow COP. What we've been doing for the last 20 years or 30 years is understanding what are the elements of transition, the elements of change that we now would need to bring together in redesigning systems fundamentally. So we look at some cases that are rather small. People often cite the case of Linköping in Sweden that has redesigned its whole transportation, fuel, energy, bio-waste system so that they implement what is formerly called urban nexus thinking, where waste is cycled and used to produce fertilizers. It's used to produce the energy for the regional train system, to fuel the vehicles for the municipality, et cetera. We see the redesign of systems by breaking down these silos, by reimagining resource cycles in cities in fundamentally different ways. But our starting point, and I'll conclude with this point, our starting point is that the city itself, the systems of cities themselves are the lock-in. We're not just locked in because we have a way of thinking or we have a policy or we have a certain technology, that we've designed systems that functioned well in the context of another era where resource scarcity was not available, where justice issues were not at the forefront. And now we have to fundamentally redesign those systems in order to achieve the outcomes that the international community, as well as local stakeholders, are advancing for the future of cities.
Great, thanks, Jeff. That's a great rallying call on which to move to a couple of our advisory committee members. So we've got Nihat and Emmanuel, who I'd like to put a couple of questions to, but if you could please just try and make your answers brief, because I do want to leave a little bit of time at the end, and we're a bit behind time, a little bit of time at the end for the audience to ask at least a couple of questions, if that would be possible. But a quick question to Nihat. And so cities in the global south, they particularly face challenges when trying to build resilient strategies. I've mentioned rapid urbanization already. Many cities are obviously poorly equipped to deal with these also because of the pace of change. Can you tell us what you think is the most important set of actions that these cities that are experiencing rapid urbanization in the global south can take to overcome such challenges?
Sure. Thank you. Just before I respond, I just want to congratulate everyone involved with the report. And thank you for having me both on the advisory committee for the report, as well as on the panel. It's been a huge sort of learning experience for me as well. So several of these challenges have already been highlighted by the authors and in the report itself. Fragmented governance, lock-ins into particular sort of unsustainable development pathways. And I think that the challenge that cities in the South face are sort of across multiple fronts. So it's not just an environmental challenge, but it's also multiple developmental challenges. There are issues of poverty, there are issues of economic growth and development. And so, I mean, as we saw the recently concluded sort of COP negotiations as well, a lot of these sort of integrated issues were brought to the forefront. And there are, that said, there are a few things that cities can do. And again, I think several of the chapter authors highlighted them across the discussions we've just heard. I think one of the things is sort of an integrated approach to planning. A lot of cities in the South tend to focus on sectoral planning, particularly either around spatial planning or land use, or particular sort of verticals around transport or economic development. And they rarely integrate, both in terms of the government departments involved, as well as in the functioning of the plans themselves. And I think that this is something that has been long advocated. And I think it would be we really do need to move very, very quickly towards thinking about these across sectors and sort of integrating planning and sort of bringing environmental planning not as sort of an aside, but front and center as integrated into all of these various issues, because so far it seems to have been dealt with as something that's an afterthought. And we really do need to try to bring it, sort of mainstream it much, much more. Another thing I'd like to echo what Andres said before is sort of integrating across scale. So to think beyond the city itself, because a lot of these rapidly urbanizing cities, as you mentioned, are growing very, very quickly, and their areas of influence grow much beyond their city boundaries themselves, and to start thinking about how we can integrate across scale. The third thing I would like to highlight is sort of the potential that is available in sort of decentralizing and devolution to local decision makers. So in a lot of cities, we see sort of a hesitancy in devolving and decentralizing power, not only to local city decision makers, but also to citizens. And I think that empowering citizens, empowering local decision makers will enable a lot of change on the ground and sort of enable a lot of bottom-up change. And so integrating and collaborating across multiple sectors, across multiple sort of citizens, across multiple groups and stakeholders in the cities, I think is sort of critical. And I think the kind of final thing that I'd like to close with is sort of this huge challenge in the lack of capacity that our governments and our government stakeholders have. We tend to see folks with very little training, very little capacity in dealing with specialist issues being thrown into kind of challenges that they really have no idea how to tackle with outdated data, with outdated methodologies in some senses. And so to be able to find ways in which we can build capacity, not just from sort of cutting edge science and research, but also to bring in sort of local native knowledges on how to deal with shocks and how to deal with systems that are changing and evolving. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Nihal. Yeah, I mean, the challenge of fundamental system change with a lack of capacity is quite a big it's quite a big one, and building that capacity for system change is obviously a priority. I'm going to come on to Emmanuel just finally before we then open it up to the audience. Hopefully, I have a little bit of time to do that. So we've heard that we can affect change. There are some concrete steps that can be taken, or should I say, nature-based steps rather than concrete steps towards environmental sustainability and social equity. And we know that C40 Cities and the Climate Leadership Group has done very well in helping cities curb their emissions. I have a stat here of 30 cities that are part of the C40 Cities Climate Leadership Group have curbed emissions by 22% on average. I'm not sure from what baseline year that is. I'm sure you can tell us to 2019. So results are being delivered, certainly on the climate front. Can you share a little bit more information on this and what the role of C40 Cities has been in ensuring that we are moving the needle on some of the issues that we've discussed today?
Thank you, Johnny, and good afternoon, everyone. Before I answer your question, I just want to know that my colleagues from the advisory committee of the GEO for Cities, who've also made a fantastic job over the last 2 years. We've been gathered a few times with ICLE, ODI, IIED, the Indian Institute for Human Settlements and others, trying to advise as wisely as we could the fantastic group of authors who collectively delivered this amazing report. So thank you. And I also want to express my gratitude and appreciation to the UNEP Secretariat, who's been driving this process, Pierre and his team specifically. Thank you for all the support. Effectively, as you said, cities are very much into action and are already delivering a lot of what is contained in this report in terms of solutions. And among the group of cities, C40 Cities have been front runners in this and really started to decarbonize the different elements of the urban system already a few decades ago, and that leads to the results you were mentioning about already several dozens of cities who have reduced their emissions. The baseline is different depending on cities, so I can't make a single answer to your question. But it is clearly the result of very decisive and determined action by mayors. Last week, the mayor of London, who's the next chair of C40, was very clearly saying at COP26 in Glasgow, cities are doers while nations are delayers. And I think this is really what defines city leadership in climate action now. The actions they are taking are immediate and quite pragmatic. Over the last years, we've seen a number of cities developing very specific sectorial action in some critical sectors such as transport, building, waste management, energy, clean construction, with this very specific and targeted objective to halve emissions by 2030. So we're not talking about midterm, long-term targets anymore. We're really talking about immediate and ambitious action that cities have taken in those sectors and are providing already results. And I think one of the other, or maybe the other big element of this action now is that this is more and more being framed as not only an ambitious action, but also an equitable action. And inclusive climate action has become also one of the main drivers of city climate policy in the last years. Mayors are pursuing both climate goals and equity goals at the same time. And when decarbonizing and electrifying the mass transit system of a city, for example, they're not only trying to reduce emissions in the cities, but also improve equity and social inclusion in the city and provide more opportunities for people in the city. I think those are very, very strong elements of city climate leadership today: immediate action and inclusive and equitable action.
Great. It's great to end on a call to action, and I'm glad you mentioned ICLEI. I think in terms of an entry point here for cities that want to get engaged and actually kind of start taking action, setting some targets. I think the Cities with Nature platform that ICLEI have, and also the work that if I put my IUCN Urban Alliance chair hat on for a second, the work we've been doing through the Urban Nature Index, which actually looks at the city both from an urban perspective, but also the telecoupled impacts and dependencies that cities have on distant ecosystems, and tries to help cities measure and set science-based targets around that to take action. I suppose as an entry point to the system change that we're talking about, we've got to start somewhere, right? So these are, I think, very useful tools to begin that journey of system change. With that, we've got a few minutes left for a Q&A with the audience. I'm so sorry that we haven't managed to find time but we had a very big panel and a relatively limited amount of time, and there was a lot to unpack there. But I hope you found some of those answers from our panelists insightful. But we will just have a few minutes, and there's a great question that's actually come in from on the Q&A, which I would like just briefly to touch on, which is from Peter King. In Southeast Asia, capital cities are being abandoned and relocated. So Jakarta, Yangon, Manila, Seoul, maybe not all the cities, but parts of some of those cities are being relocated. How should countries balance the need to fix deteriorating, sinking, polluted, potentially inundated cities and the new cities approach, in inverted commas? So I suppose this is about we hear a lot about stranded assets, but this is really about stranded liabilities. And I think increasingly in the post-climate change world, we will be seeing more of these stranded liabilities. What do we do with these stranded liabilities? Do we try to fix them, or do we just up sticks and move somewhere else? Who wants to take that one? Any volunteers from the panel? I'm not seeing any hands. So,
let me, I'm thinking on my feet here.
Hi.
Hi, Johnny. This is an extremely complicated one, the sort of planned migration of people from highly vulnerable areas. I think that there are many areas, and we know this both in the developing world and the developed world, that especially on coastlines, there is likely no reasonable investment opportunity to actually ultimately save those areas from being day-to-day perils for the people that reside in them. And so the question is, how do we work with those? And they're often the self-built communities that are most vulnerable. So let us remember that It's the people who are never provided proper access to land, to tenure, to infrastructure, to resources, who have been forced to settle in these extremely hazardous areas. And so, I mean, it really comes back to the fundamental challenge that's been sitting with the international community and with governments at all levels for the longest time, is how do we provide, create the system, let's talk about transformation pathways, how do we create a system where, as a fundamental right, supported right, people have access to the land and to housing and tenure, and work with them as collaborators in doing self-built community work. Because the challenge is, of course, there's a fad these days of new cities, which tend to be driven by industry, they're very capital intensive projects. So there's a profit motive often behind a new city's building. But most of the urban spaces in the world are being self-built by people who are still migrating from rural areas, or who are part of growing populations in existing informal settlement areas. So the question is, what is the nature of the partnership we have to help provide for these most vulnerable populations access to land and to the basic resources, and which includes their own resources as city builders, as community builders, to build communities and these places. And so the short answer, that was a long answer, extemporaneously, I might add. But the short answer is yes, we're going to have to rebuild urban spaces in places of great peril. And unfortunately, it is crisis that is forcing the process. As I said earlier, transformation actually tends more to happen in a crisis situation than it does in a planful situation. And so now we have to be prepared to be a little bit ahead of the crisis. And of course, we could talk about many places of the world where they're beginning to think about this planned migration challenge.
Great, thanks, Jeb. I'll maybe just ask one more question of everybody before I try and sum up in 1 minute. We've got about 3 minutes left. So, I mean, we are undergoing a digital revolution in terms of the availability of data, knowledge, collating all that together and using it to make better, faster decisions. And cities are becoming more and more digital. Is this? Do you see this as potentially one of the mechanisms by which we can unlock the system change that we're talking about, or is this, or is it something more fundamental than that? So what role of the increasing availability of knowledge and data at all different levels, and how is that going to help us? Does anybody want to take that one on?
Neha has her hand on, and Andres as well.
So I can't see hands for some reason, but so you might have
I'll just quickly respond. I think the question that what we've seen over the last couple of years has also been that while there has been an increasing amount of digital access, it's also not been uniform. And I think that we do need to think about how we sort of democratize a lot of this, because especially in the Indian context, in the last couple of years has really thrown into sort of stark reality the massive divide that exists within our cities, and in terms of sort of who has access to a lot of this information and how it's being used. And so I think that just thinking about the data and the technology alone isn't going to help us provide any solutions. I think we're going to need to have to think about it together with sort of making sure that we are able to extend that access to a lot of the communities that sort of Jeb was talking about as well.
Great, thanks, Neha. Any more reflections on the?
Yeah, I was going to say thanks, Neha, for what you said. You allow me to delve into other things, but one of the big opportunities I see is citizen science. We usually don't have the data at the scale we require. So basically, having citizen science and people contributing to their solutions is a great opportunity. And just keep in mind that having the data doesn't mean that we have the solution. We still have to think on how to use the information.
Right. Yeah, that's a very good point, of course, because citizen science is a form of empowerment, right? It's a form of democratization. It is a form of a way of the citizens of the city kind of taking control almost of the future shape of their city. I'm going to have to close because we've got about 30 seconds left. What can I say in conclusion, apart from to say thank you very much to all the panelists and fantastic contributions. Sorry we didn't get a bit more time for questions. I think I'd say in conclusion that this is about system change, and whilst it's complex, there are pathways to transformations. And we've started to unpack and explore some of those transformations in the GEO for Cities report, which is fantastic because it's solutions oriented. And we must and we can change, I think, as long as we embrace that challenge of changing those systems, that the complexity of those systems on which our cities are currently founded. We are in the urban century, you know, the 21st century is the urban century. And for me, the potential for cities is absolutely extraordinary in terms of the transformative effect that they can have on human life, but also the natural world, if we get this right. Effectively, what we're sitting on at the moment, I think, is a set of liabilities, and if we can turn those liabilities into assets in the next 50 years in this urban century, I think we'll have gone through one of the most important periods of human history. So I think this report is pretty important in that context. I encourage everybody to read it. It is one of those reports which actually really rewards a careful read and a sit down, not just the executive summary, but I would really encourage everybody to find the time to actually read it, reflect on it, because it's excellent. Okay, I'm gonna end there because we're already 1 minute over, and just to say a massive thanks again to all the panelists and all the contributors. And thank you for a really insightful event this morning. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks to everybody for joining us and staying on.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye.